chapter talks about the nervous system. Another section talks about brain parts, and then the final section talks about the endocrine system, which is our system of glands. First, let me briefly mention the nervous system. The nervous system means all of the nerves in our body, all of the nerve cells in our body. But if you're talking about a single nerve cell, that's called a neuron. And there's a lovely picture of a neuron in your book. And so you should look at that picture of neuron and look at its different parts and learn its different parts, as a matter of fact. A neural message travels across the neuron both electrically and chemically. There's an electrical message that shoots across and jumps to the next neuron or nerve cell, and there's also a chemical message that shoots across and travels to the next neuron. A neural message travels from about 20 to 300 feet per second. And so that's actually pretty slow. It sounds fast, but it's actually pretty slow compared to the speed of light or something else. All right, now one thing I want you to notice about the neuron when you're studying it is the chemical message that goes across. As I mentioned to you before, a chemical message goes across. And neurons, little nerve cells, are not actually stuck together. There's a tiny gap called a synapse between each neuron. And so one neuron creates chemicals that shoot out across the gap like little ships on a sea and go across that little gap and either stimulate or inhibit the next neuron or the next nerve cell. Those little chemicals that go across that gap are called neural transmitters because they transmit the neural message from one neuron to the next. And there are many different kinds, and they're discussed in your book. Those neurons make the difference, or rather neural transmitters make the difference in whether we are healthy or unhealthy, or whether we have mental disorders, and so on. And many different disorders have been implicated in these neurotransmitters. Schizophrenia, Parkinson's disorder, and a number of others have been implicated with the amount of the levels of these neurotransmitters in your brain. Even your personality, whether you're outgoing and risk-taking or whether you're fearful and cautious, even that's affected by the levels of these neurotransmitters. Also in this chapter, you'll find on another page a map of the nervous system. The central nervous system is in the middle, that's your brain and spinal cord, and then all of the rest of the peripheral nerves, peripheral because they're on the outside periphery, coming out and going everywhere else in our body, are also labeled in your book. The one part of the peripheral nervous system that I'd like you to pay a special attention to is the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the peripheral nervous system, springs into action whenever we are aroused, whenever there's some kind of an emergency. Sometimes they call it the fight or flight section of our nervous system. And so when we're aroused, the sympathetic nervous system goes into action, and our blood pressure increases, our pulse increases, our pupils dilate, blood is shunted to where we need it to fight or run or whatever. And so the sympathetic nervous system is very important whenever we are aroused. All right, next let me mention briefly a few different brain parts. Your book divides it up into many different sections on brain parts. I'm just going to mention 3 here sections. The lower portion of the brain, way down low, has to do with, well, one of the things it has to do with is sleep and wakeful cycles. The pons, for example, is the part of the brain that has to do with sleep and wakeful cycles, whereas the reticular activating system has more to do with when you are awake and alert and that sort of thing. As we move on up to the middle part of the brain, we find the hypothalamus, and we also find the limbic system. In the limbic system, we see like the amygdala that has to do with aggression. And if you've ever heard of the famous lobotomy, they actually would go into the temporal lobe and remove part of that and the underlying amygdala. We don't do that in these days, of course. That's a horrible and barbaric surgery. Also, the amygdala is there. Also, in the limbic system, so is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a large memory center where memories first come in and are processed as short-term memories, and then they need to be shoved on up to the top part of the brain so that they can be stored as permanent long-term memories. But that's where the memories first come in, at the hippocampus. Also, I mentioned the hypothalamus is in this part of the brain. I have seen more studies on the hypothalamus than any other part of the brain. I swear it just does everything. Regulating emotions, it has to do with controlling the endocrine system, it has to do with hunger, it has to do with thirst. Let me today just mention hunger and thirst. There are 2 parts of the hypothalamus that have to do with well, let's just talk about hunger. I'll just stay with hunger. There is two parts of the hypothalamus that have to do with hunger. One is the VMH, the ventral medial of the hypothalamus. That, in fact, is the stop eating center of your brain. Whereas the lateral hypothalamus, this is the start eating center. So together, those two parts work together to tell us when we're hungry and when we should stop eating. You know, if let's say we get a little bit above the weight that we normally weigh, our hypothalamus will be sending out signals from the VMH saying you need to stop now. Whereas if we get a little below, signals will come out from the LH saying you need to eat, you're hungry. And so together those systems, along with a lot of other social cues, help to determine our set point. Our set point is the weight that's typical for each one of us. Each one of us has a weight that's kind of normal for us. All right. And then we can move on up to the cortex. And the cortex is really the thinking part of the brain and the wrinkly, convoluted top part of the brain. And the cortex is divided into four main parts. The front part of the cortex is called the frontal lobe. And that's the part of the brain that has to do with thinking, judgment, reason. That's the part that helps us to regulate our emotions. You know, raw, ragged emotions are coming up from down below. But this part of the brain says, you know, you need to exercise some judgment. You can't just fly off in rage or whatever. Okay, then on top here is called the parietal lobe, and that part of the brain has to do with interpreting bodily sensations. Then back here in the back is called the occipital lobe, like ocular, occipital lobe, and that part of the brain has to do with vision primarily, understanding what we see. Hallucinations that are caused when people take drugs or when they're psychotic are caused in the occipital lobe. So are the visual things you see in your dreams caused in the occipital lobes. The temporal lobes do a number of things. There's some memory stored there and whatnot, but temporal lobes have to do with hearing, interpreting auditory sounds that are coming in from our ears. Then finally, let me mention the endocrine system. The endocrine system is the last section of this chapter, and that's our system of glands in our bodies. Smooth glands that produce tiny hormones that they dump straight into our bloodstream, and they affect, again, our health and well-being. The master gland up in the brain that controls all the other glands is called the pituitary. And it sends out little chemicals to other glands to tell them what to do. The pituitary does many things. It controls our growth rates and things like that. But as I said, it also sends out chemicals to control the other glands. Some of the other glands in the endocrine system would be our gonads, such as testicles in males and ovaries in females. As you know, those glands produce hormones that cause us to mature into our adult body shape and size and reproductive capabilities. Those glands also produce chemicals that cycle women through their monthly cycles. They also produce chemicals that cause us to be aroused when we need to be. Other glands in the endocrine system would involve things such as the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands produce chemicals like adrenaline and other things, corticosteroids that cause us to be aroused when we are in a stressful situation and we need quick action. So that's our stress gland. Other glands would be like the pancreas that has to do with controlling our sugar levels. People with diabetes may have problems with their pancreas. The thyroid has to do with metabolizing calories. And finally then, this little teeny gland up in the brain called the pineal gland has to do with sleep and being able to relax to go to sleep. It also has to do with animals when they mate in the spring and all that. It sends them signals to be aroused and ready to mate. That's why animals mate in the spring. In fact, the pineal gland sends out those little signals. Okay, that's enough for chapter 2. That's just an overview. Again, refer to your study guide for more words that I've given you to help you get ready for your exam number 1.